Hello everyone, this is Sofia Smallstorm. I am doing another podcast today. It is almost mid-January, and my guest is someone that I have great admiration for, Nancy Turner Banks. She wrote this absolutely amazing book, AIDS, Opium, Diamonds, and Empire, which I have covered in stickies, and it's now going to be impossible for me to read it ever again. I'll have to start again with a fresh book. But I really recommend that everybody look into this book of Dr. Banks. She's actually a doctor, trained at Harvard Medical School, practiced in obstetrics, gynecology, and gynecological oncology. And she also, very unusually for a doctor, has an MBA in finance. So she's covered the spectrum, and I'll introduce her now personally. Hi, Nancy. How are you?
I'm terrific, and Happy New Year.
Oh, yes, to you too, and to everybody listening. I really hope we have such a thing. But Nancy, we're going to take a sort of winding course in this interview, but can you tell the audience why you started with AIDS, and we're going to connect it to this Ebola crisis in Africa as well.
Well, one of the things that concerned me is that they were trying to position HIV, which they said was the virus that caused the disease of AIDS, which is really not one disease. It's a combination. It's a syndrome of any one of 29 different diseases. And they said it was sexually transmitted. So I'm a gynecologist. My specialty, of course, is in treating women, and of course that also includes sexually transmitted diseases. And the epidemiology of this particular syndrome did not equate with any of the known sexually transmitted diseases. And the long-term studies that looking at two partners, one who was positive for HIV and one who was negative, basically showed that there was no sexual transmission between those two partners. The best study was out of Northern California by a researcher by the name of Nancy Padian, P-A-D-I-A-N, and she did a 10-year prospective study in which she found after 10 years and looking at these partners that there was no evidence of any transmission. So when I read that study, I said, this can't be a sexually transmitted disease. Also, I wasn't seeing it in my practice, and neither were my colleagues. So that began the beginning of why I began to look into this particular problem.
Right, and in your book, you lay out a really amazing analysis that AIDS is in fact, as pretty much all diseases, it's a result of an imbalance in the body's redox levels, right?
Yeah. One of the
reduction, oxidation, oxidative stress.
Yeah. 100 years ago in medicine, there was a real debate raging between two French scientists. One was named Pasteur, whom everyone probably knows at this point, and the other, his name was Béchamp. Pasteur had the idea that organisms cause disease. Béchamp had the idea that organisms could only take hold in a body that was already under stress, under some kind of biological stress. And he said that the organisms would show up in a biological terrain, that is the body, that was either toxic or deficient in some nutrient. At any rate, Pasteur won because his model and the model of Robert Koch, a German scientist who decided to develop a way in which you could isolate and claim that a particular organism was causing a particular disease, became de rigueur in medicine, because then you could sell a drug or a vaccine, and that those two scientists actually supported the vaccine drug industry of the Rockefeller cartel. And Béchamp has all but been forgotten, but these are theories that still have not been resolved. After having practiced medicine for more than 25 years, I came to the conclusion that certainly the underlying condition of the person who is developing a disease is as fundamental as any kind of bacteria or virus that may take hold.
So it has to do basically with body toxicities on the cellular level, cellular exhaustion, the inability of cells to do their basic housekeeping, and then they collapse and become victims of conditions of either degeneration or disease or even cancer, right? This is the important thing that I learned from your book, and I've held it. It's been sort of like a super concept for me in my understanding of everything since that relates to health.
Right, because at the cellular level, people should remember that cells can only do so many things. They can do what they're supposed to do, or they can differentiate into a different cell type, but it's still a healthy cell, or they can de-differentiate, which is a cell which is using less energy. They can divide, they can die, and they can die by several ways. One rapidly is called necrosis. A more controlled death is called apoptosis. But that's about it in terms of what cells can do. But there are messages that these cells receive in order for them to decide what they're going to do. But the messages are not the science that we have today has focused simply on the genetic and the biochemical. But the messages are the redox that you talk about, the oxidation reduction, actually has to do with the energetics of the cell. So if we really want to talk about how cells function, we have to look at the energy level and how the energy level is up or down, because that really is going to be the controlling element for the messages that are sent in the cell. Because, people need to remember, cells essentially are made up of atoms, and atoms are electrons and protons. And basically, they function by vibrations, by electromagnetic energy, and at the cellular level, those are the basic ways in which the cell communicates in order for the biochemistry to do what it does.
Right, so a cell that is able to gain energy to keep going is the healthy cell, and the cell that starts expiring because it loses too much energy and it can't acquire electrons. That is the cell that is going to either die or turn glycolytic and cancerous. Right,
and that's basically one of the theories today that that cells, because of the oxidation of cells age. That's one of the theories that we have about aging today. But the problem is that the cell is not linear. It's complex. It's a multitude of systems that feed off of each other. So it's very difficult to say if X happens, definitely B is going to happen. But there are certain things that we can know. We can know if there are certain elements missing in the cell, those elements which provide the cell with energy, such as the master antioxidant glutathione, that the cell is not going to function optimally. And that's going to affect multiple systems within the cell. It's going to affect how well whether the cell can divide. It's going to affect the immune cells on whether they're able to fight off diseases. It's going to affect the liver cells and whether that they can detoxify substances that come into the body. So depending on what organ you're talking about, this lack of energy is going to affect that particular organ in a particular way that has to do with the function of that organ.
Now, in your book, you talk about evolutionary biological laws. And that kind of that sets the framework for what happens in the body, that cell systems, this is a quote from your book, will always react, modulate, and adapt, and will follow the same evolutionary biological laws, no matter what the damage is to them or the stressors upon them, which can include psychological stress. So if you want to comment on that and elucidate a little bit, but we could also talk about how sexually transmitted disease in America called AIDS did not end up being the same thing in Africa because I'll let you take over.
Well, first of all, let's just briefly discuss a little bit of evolutionary biology, because this becomes crucial, and it allows us to take people away from the theory of genetic determinism, which is really, since 2000, has pretty much been a dead theory, although they continue to push it as if it has some validity. But in the scientific area, it has been shown that so what does it mean if I say it's a dead theory? A theory has to have predictive value. That is, if I say that gravity, certain things about gravity, and everything that I say after that theory will predict that objects will fall at a certain rate. So that's a theory. The theory predicts that certain things are going to happen. The theory of genetic determinism ended up not giving a prediction on how the cell actually works, but that's too deep a discussion to go on here. But what happened is that one of the theories about how the eukaryotic cell, and all of our cells in our body are called eukaryotic cells, and that is because our genetic material is surrounded by a membrane. But it turns out the eukaryotic cell ancestrally is the result of the fusion 2 billion years ago of two different types of bacteria. And one bacteria primarily used oxidation to use for energy, and the other used something called glycolysis for energy. So these two cells use two different types of energy, but they were able to combine. Now, today, most of those two cells still exist. The cell that came into the other cell is now called the mitochondria. The mitochondria is that place in the cell that provides much of the energy that allows us to live. The other thing that happened over time is that the mitochondria transferred most of its DNA to the central nucleus. So the central nucleus is a chimera. It's a combination of two different bacteria. The interesting thing is that after 2 billion years, our nucleus still operates. It operates in an organized manner, but it still operates separately. For example, the genes from the first bacteria operate to do one type of function, and the genes from the mitochondria operate to do another type of function. They each receive different types of signals. For example, the first gene operates mostly on reductive signals. The second gene operates mostly on oxidative signals. And so when those signals are absent or missing in the cell, these two genetic hybrids begin to break down their functions and begin to, again, operate separately as if it's the old atmosphere of the Earth. So the theory that Lynn Margulis is the biologist who really pushed this theory. It was called the theory of endosymbiosis, that is, two organisms combine to create one organism. Well, what happens in disease is that combination, which I just talked about, begins to break down. And these two organisms, which ordinarily live symbiotically, begin to break down, and I call it dyssymbiosis. That is, they begin to not cooperate and begin to have separate functions. And this is what we call disease. This is what happens in a disease state.
So the cell, which operates in two different ways and is separated in that regard, and this evolved 2 billion years ago, part of the cell is oxygen-based, part of the cell is sugar-based, right?
No, part of the cell is oxygen. No, that's not correct. The signals are either oxidative or reductive. That is, the signals either take an electron or they give an electron.
Okay, so I thought you were talking about the parts of the cells that combined from 2 billion years ago.
Right, I am, but I'm talking about the signals, the energetic signals that they use to determine how they're going to function.
Okay.
The whether it's sugar or whether it's whether they're using glycolysis or whether they're using oxidative metabolism has to do with these redox signals.
Okay, so the signal, the two different kinds of signaling or signal using in the cell break down.
Right.
So that what happens? The cell mainly goes to oxidation. It loses when it's diseased, right?
So,
loses
right.
energy.
So when the cell does not have enough electrons, to function, it begins to lose its ability to communicate with other parts of the cell. And so what happens is that, and this happens over time, which is why, diseases don't happen suddenly. They generally happen over time. And if people develop a particular disease, that usually indicates that there is some either toxicity or deficiency that they've had in their body that they haven't recognized or hasn't been recognized by the current medical paradigm. Okay,
so when the cell breaks down in this way, does it eventually expire? Does it die? Or
well, if it's for example, if there's an acute assault, the cells can die either by necrosis or what we call apoptosis, and that's what happens when we have, say, an acute disease, like we have a flu or we have a fever or we have some disease which is transient. It lasts for about a week or so and then it's over.
Okay.
But in those cases, the body generally has enough reserve to be able to overcome whatever assault happened. Go ahead.
Well, so apoptosis is regulated cell death or cell division,
right.
And necrosis is sudden cell.
Right, exactly. And it's not regulated.
Okay, so cancer, when a cell goes into unregulated cell division, which most people understand, cancer is this constantly dividing, multiplying cell, which is in a sort of, I call it, it's gone psycho. It's trying to preserve itself. That's apoptosis.
No, that's exactly the opposite of apoptosis.
No, being ignored, I said.
Yeah, what happens, you're correct. I'm sorry I interrupted.
That's okay.
The answer is yes. What happens in cancer cells no longer receive the correct signals. That is, at some point a cell develops and then it divides and then it stops dividing. And those are the normal controls that a cell has. For example, during embryogenesis, when the baby is developing, there are signals. There's this theory of morphogenesis signals, these electromagnetic signals that are given off by the organism itself to say this part grows, that part grows. So there's a lot of cell division in embryogenesis from the time of conception until the baby is born. So that's normal development in cell division, but cancer is abnormal development in cell division because it really is when the cell does not have the type of energy that it needs to function optimally, but it still does not have the signals that it needs to die. And so what happens, it continues to propagate, and it continues to propagate because the signals that it's receiving are almost the signals that occurred on the ancient Earth 2 billion years ago. So it reverts to that ancient memory of the ancient environment of the Earth, and it begins to propagate, but it propagates at the expense of the healthy cells.
So it goes primitive on us.
Exactly. It goes backwards. Instead of being endosymbiotic, it becomes dyssymbiotic.
So what is AIDS then, please?
Well, first of all, there is no such thing as AIDS. As I said before, that AIDS is, they have defined it as 29 different diseases. But and that's the confusion of it. So the theory is that a virus called human immunodeficiency virus causes AIDS. That's the theory. The theory is not that the virus causes AIDS. The theory is that the virus causes AIDS. AID is defined as a decrease in a certain type of lymphocyte, which is a certain type of white cell that helps to fight infections. And as a result of as attacking and killing this particular white cell, the patient will eventually go on to develop one of these 29 different diseases. So if people understand that that's the theory, you can immediately understand that the theory is nonsense. First, let's start back at the beginning. The HIV is supposed to be an RNA virus, and that even in virology, they know that RNA viruses are not pathogenic. And we'll put a footnote on that and come back to it, because that will allow us some of the genetic discussion and get us into the Ebola issue and the new genetics. So HIV was said to be a retrovirus, an RNA virus. But RNA viruses, we know, are not pathogenic. So already that was an argument that was put forth by a researcher by the name of Peter Duesberg almost 30 years ago. So that was one of the first caveats that people should have been aware of, certainly physicians, not lay people. The second thing is that it was claimed that this particular virus was killing CD4 T cells. That's another caveat, because after 30 years, they still have no theory of how this happens. The other problem is this. This particular CD4 T cell, there are multiple subsets of this cell. There are one subset that has to do with what we call cell-mediated immunity, and another set that has to do with humoral immunity. The problem with people who develop AIDS is a problem with their cell-mediated immunity, because these people, their humoral immunity is intact. That is, they are making a lot of antibodies. Now, in all of the studies that they've done over 30 years, interestingly, they've only been able to find what they are calling HIV, and we will define that in a moment, in the cells that are increasing. Now, remember, the theory is the cells are supposed to be decreasing, but the cells that are increasing are the CD4 T cells that produce antibodies. And we know that because the HIV test is an antibody test. So the cells that are supposedly decreasing, they have not been able to find what they call HIV in those cells. So clearly the HIV, if it's not there, if it even existed, it's not even in those cells. It couldn't be the cause of this particular problem.
Didn't you open your book with a list of over 70 conditions that would give you a positive HIV reading that might give you, because HIV is a non-specific antibody test.
Yeah, it is a non-specific, but this gets confusing, and I'd like to clarify before we get into the antibody test this issue with the T cells, because this is the theory, and clearly the theory is it predicts that the virus kills the T cells, and as a result, the people get the disease. But clearly, if the virus is not in the T cells that are decreasing, then it cannot possibly be the cause of the disease. Now, so what did they find out early on? One of the things they found out early on in people who were HIV positive and people who had AIDS, that they had a 30 to 60% reduction in an antioxidant called glutathione. Now, early at about the same time that AIDS was being defined as a particular disease, advanced textbooks of biology were already saying that if someone had a 20 to 30% reduction in their glutathione, they were going to have cellular disease. So they knew that, and it has been completely ignored for 30 years. So the process was so what they were calling HIV in fact was a deficiency disease, which was brought on historically in a subset of gay men and drug users who were using a lot of oxidative stressors, such as drugs called poppers and all kinds of drugs, and they were having multiple sexual partners, and they had multiple different kinds of infections that had nothing to do with AIDS per se, and they were using not only street drugs, they were using pharmaceutical drugs prophylactically. So it was a combination of things that happened at a particular time in history that allowed a particular subset of people to show up oxidatively stressed, and it became an infection, and it became a sexually transmitted disease, according to the CDC.
Now, can I ask you a question? Do you think there's any possibility that this kind of crazy lifestyle and the recreational drug use was encouraged in these groups in order to collapse them and get them into an energy deficient condition where they would develop, the real body crisis and start dying?
Well, one part of what was going on in the 60s was a real effort. We know that certain governmental agencies. Well, let's recall what was going on historically. There were young people all over this country that were marching in the civil rights movement, in the women's movement, in the anti-war movement. So young people in the United States were becoming politically aware and politically active. The last thing that the elites want is for a mass of people to be aware of the craziness that and the crimes that they are committing. And so there was a concerted effort, and it came out of some very high-level institutions, Harvard, Stanford, to introduce drugs such as LSD and other drugs into the market. This was also during the Vietnam War, when the United States was displacing France as the major purveyor of opium out of Vietnam, and they introduced opium and heroin to the soldiers in Vietnam, and they started importing a lot of those drugs into the United States. And so there was a concerted effort. It's been well documented by various governmental agencies to begin to infest communities in the United States with drugs and with a degradation of lifestyle.
That's for sure. We know that. So that you're saying that, yes, there might, I'm trying to make a bridge to the homosexual community and the intravenous drug users. So was that encouraged at all in order to create this template of viral disease that would then, possibly wipe out people all over the world?
Well, I think it was, well, first of all, I think we need to stop acting as if the powers that be are that smart. I think basically what they wanted to do was to stop this political movement, and they were going to do it by any means necessary. And the means by which they chose to do it was to change people's behaviors. So they changed people's behaviors. Once those behaviors changed, and they began to see other things, I think then they began to use those changed behaviors and the illnesses that showed up in a way that was profitable to them. That's what they do. They never let a crisis go to waste.
Right.
So I don't think that they plan every crisis, but I think they take advantage of every crisis.
Yes,
they're not that smart. They're strategically smart, but they're not as scientifically smart as people think.
So let's talk about AIDS as an energy deficiency disease. You've pointed out to me in your writings and also when we've spoken that it rather than being called acquired immune deficiency, it should be acquired energy deficiency.
Well, the reason is as I said before, the major antioxidant or energy provider. Remember, things that are antioxidants provide energy or provide electrons. Things that are oxidative take energy or take electrons. So the glutathione has a sulfhydryl group, which is key in providing excess electrons in the cell. These excess electrons allow all of the functionings, the normal functioning of the cell, the normal division, the normal oxidative, the normal use of the mitochondria through phosphorylative oxidation to allow the energy, one of the energy molecules, ATP, to develop. But the other important thing is this. ATP, which most people, when they think of energy in the cell, they think that's the energy of the cell. But the other thing that happens in the mitochondria is that there are millions per second of these what we call redox reactions. Well, it turns out that these redox reactions are simply reactions in which an electron goes from one energy level to another energy level. When that happens, photons or tiny lights of energy are given off, and these photons can create an electromagnetic wave. And these waves and these photons are actually part of the energy of the cell and part of the propagation of what allows the cell to keep itself together. So what happens if you don't have enough electrons to float that particular wave of energy in the cell, then what you're going to have, again, is these reduced energy levels which do not allow the cell to function optimally. And so that's what was going on with people with who were said to be HIV positive. The other thing that they did early on, they introduced a drug called AZT. Now, remember, I'm saying that these people were oxidized. They did not have enough electrons as the result of certain drugs and other lifestyle habits. So what do the powers that be do? What does CDC and the FDA do? They approved this cancer drug, this drug that was developed to treat cancer, which was so toxic it was shelved. They fast track it. It usually takes almost 10 years for a drug to get approved. In less than 3 months, they approved this very toxic drug, and they started feeding it in high doses to these sick people. These people began to die off in droves, and they were dying because of the drugs that they were given. And it appeared as if there was an epidemic. But the epidemic was caused by the medical community themselves giving these toxic people this toxic drug, which really, put them in the grave.
And nobody ever spoke of increasing nutrients, increasing things like glutathione.
For 30 years, people have been doing it, but nobody is listening to the people who are trying to really help these people, except a lot of people listen, because a lot of the gay community stopped using poppers, clean their lifestyle up. And even in the AIDS literature, you will find that the people who are long-term survivors are generally those people who did take the antiretroviral drugs and changed their lifestyle and took control of their health.
Yeah. Well, it's good because the whole AIDS fever has died out a little bit, it seems, and it's been replaced by other things in far-off continents. Now, the AIDS in Africa is another situation of severe oxidation in people's bodies due to conditions that have been imposed on them by foreign powers, right?
Well, one of the things I looked at, especially because they said AIDS was very high in South Africa, and they were calling tuberculosis AIDS. But what was happening in South Africa? One of the biggest industries in South Africa, of course, is mining. Diamonds, copper, and other things. But one of the things that happens in those mines is that there's asbestos and other kinds of toxins which get into the lungs of the miners. And so for years, the miners have been getting lung diseases, including tuberculosis. So now that they could classify tuberculosis as a lung tuberculosis as a sexually transmitted disease, the mining companies, which are the De Beers, the usual group of people that we have talked about in the past who own these mines, they could now classify their workers as having a sexually transmitted disease rather than a work-related disease.
Why did they say that TB was transmitted sexually? I don't even understand
Well,
that.
Nobody understands this. That's the craziness of it. It's not logical. It's not medically logical. It's not scientifically logical. It's not logical. But you can they can say anything and they get away with it. I mean, you just turn on television any day of the week in the United States, and 90% of it is going to be a lie. They can get away with it. People believe it. And people, even physicians, are not questioning these things.
Yeah, it's really amazing. And, I see exactly the logic here now, that it's not a work-related disease. The blame is put on you personally, right? And a culture personally.
Exactly, because you're promiscuous and you brought this on yourself. And so now I'm the company. I am totally free from any obligation to pay you workman's compensation. And that especially became important because remember they began to say that this was a problem in South Africa at the time that apartheid was falling, which meant that the workers, before apartheid, the black workers had no say. After apartheid, that meant that the black workers would be able to challenge these corporations as to getting payment for these work-related diseases. So it was a political tool in that regard, in that part of the world.
Wow. And I watched a film made by the husband of Christine Majori. She wrote the book, What If Everything You Knew About AIDS Was Wrong? And this was a film on AIDS in South Africa, and AIDS in Africa also a little bit, where it's called the wasting disease. And they've managed to convince many Africans that they are going to or have the wasting disease. So I know that you were in Africa yourself. And first of all, I have to commend you on your mastery of biochemistry. It's really pretty extraordinary, honestly. And I don't know any other MD who's got the knowledge you have. You are just absolutely up there by yourself.
Well, one of the things that people need to remember that after during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, many of the African countries were struggling for independence from the colonial masters in European colonial powers, and many of them, the Europeans decided that having military presence was no longer to their benefit, but they were going to, after the Second World War, they figured out how they could begin to control countries monetarily without all of the soldiers in place. But the problem is that the last thing that they wanted were leaders in these countries, and this is the same thing with Central America and South America. The last thing they wanted were the leaders in those countries that actually believed in their own countries or were Pan-Africanist. And so what you see is that people like Patrice Lumumba was murdered with the help of our own CIA, and someone like Mobutu Sese Seko was installed in the Congo. And that happened all throughout Africa, so that these so-called leaders were installed by the European powers to control the resources to control the resources, and also they use the IMF and the World Bank to keep these countries in debt. So there was, so there were multiple things that were going on. So the level of displacement and poverty is astronomical, and it's still going on. For example, everybody's talking about Palestine, and I am very sorry about what is happening to the Palestinian people. But over the last 10 years, almost 10 million people have been slaughtered in the Congo as the result of largely Israeli and American Zionist business people supplying the arms and creating the chaos that would allow them to come in and take control of the resources in those countries. It's really horrendous. So this has been going on for a long time. So people are being displaced from their homelands. They are also, the environment is being degraded. They are lacking in foodstuffs. There's very little infrastructure being built. And so that people are beginning to get sick under these conditions is a surprise? No. But you can label those conditions, you can put a label on those conditions and continue to create a kind of fear in the population, which sort of knocks the population off. So it's this strategy of war, which does not have to necessarily do with arms, but has to do with destroying and controlling populations by other means.
Yeah, it's I'm writing notes as you talk. And yeah, we can all see this, and it's just so sad. Africa is such a rich continent in terms of resources, and it's clear that there's chaos that's deliberately created. People are set upon one another. They're supplied with weapons. Everything is fomented, and so that war conditions fester and erupt all over the place. And the people are dying from that too. They're dying from the lack of amenities that they ought to have, and because the control of their resources is completely in the hands of other people, while they are distracted and destroyed in these battles, right?
And people need to remember, 100 years ago in the West had multiple outbreaks of infections. Why did the infectious rate go down in the West? It didn't go down because of the introduction of vaccines or antibiotics. Those certainly helped, but we're talking about an epidemiological issue, and we're talking about the rate of decline of infectious diseases. The rate of decline of infectious diseases occurred in the West because the West was able to begin to put in infrastructure. They began to have sewage. They began to have lighting. They began to have running water. They began to have those kinds of things which allowed the waste of cities and the waste of people to be taken away from those people and to be taken care of in such a way that it didn't continue to recirculate and cause disease in the population. Because that was one of the reasons that so many people died in Europe over time. They had no real infrastructure in terms of how to get rid of waste. Human and otherwise, and also after the Industrial Revolution, it became a serious problem. They really didn't get rid of infectious diseases in the United States until the World War II, when the soldiers were stationed in the South, and they had to finally figure out how to stop, things like typhoid and malaria. And so the infrastructure of a country or a community really is, and the education of the people, and of course the rising ability of the people to earn enough to have a certain level of living, a standard of living. And all of those are absent in many parts of Africa at this time for a lot of reasons. But let's look at, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, where this so-called outbreak of Ebola is. Well, recently they found an Archean age craton, which is full of huge diamonds, alluvial diamonds, which are 300 plus carats. Oh, gee, it just happens that Ebola breaks out in the area where they found this huge cache of potentially very expensive rocks, which can be used in industry. So all of a sudden, there's a disease in that area. First of all, again, they said Ebola was an RNA virus. The minute you hear something is RNA, immediately they're not telling you the truth. Secondly, what is Ebola? It's a type of hemorrhagic fever. But there are many types of hemorrhagic fevers. So hemorrhagic fevers are not something that are unknown in tropical climates. And they're trying to make people afraid in temperate climates, but tropical diseases don't take hold in temperate climates. So that's another nonsensical kind of thing. But we don't really know what people are dying of. The other problem is in this area is that the World Health Organization has been doing all kinds of vaccines and other kinds of testing of drugs in these areas. So between the lack of infrastructure, the finding of these diamonds and other kinds of minerals, and the wars that have been going on, especially in Liberia and Sierra Leone, these make wars, there's a breakdown of the community. So the fact that there would be some sort of disease breakout is not a wonder.
Right, and then we don't know because we're not there, and we're relying on very false and twisted media reports. But this cache of diamonds, when was this discovered?
In March of 2014 was the first outbreak of what they called Ebola in Liberia. In August of 2013, Yusef Diamond Mining announced this discovery.
So August, wow.
August of 2013, yeah.
13,
yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
within less than a year of that announcement, and now what is happening? One of the things that is happening is that they are now, the United States and Europe is doing satellite images. They said they want to do satellite images to see how the disease is spreading. Well, satellite images to see how a disease is spreading? I don't think so. This is how stupid they think the rest of us are. You don't do satellite images to see how a disease is spreading. But you do satellite images if you want to know what the resources are in a particular part of the world. So yeah. they have all kinds of excuses for the shenanigans that they're hiding. They hide behind all kinds of stories in order to steal people's resources.
And people, you're extremely logical. That's another quality that you have that I've noticed. Plus you have this depth of information in many different areas. And it becomes very hard. For instance, if I were to read a report that they're doing satellite imaging to see how disease spreads, I would probably be skeptical, but I wouldn't have the kind of very, precise ability to blow it apart that you just gave us. And so, I want to do multiple interviews with you, if you don't mind, over time.
Sure.
Wow. Well, this is you've led us down a very rich path of information, and I would like very much to talk about viral theory for a few minutes, if you can get into that for us.
Okay, this will be my last topic for today, but yeah. I do want to discuss this, especially the RNA. First of all, let's talk about genetic material. There are two types of genetic material. DNA, which is in our central genome, and RNA, which is another type of genetic material, which has a different type of function. Now, it turns out that it's possible that the first type of genetic material on Earth was actually RNA. And it turns out also that almost 45% of the human genome is retrotranscribed, that it is transcribed from RNA into DNA. So almost 50%, 45% of the human genome is in fact this, what we call, they have a term for it, they're called retrotransposons. And that is that it's DNA, but it was actually first retrotranscribed from RNA. Now, what does that mean? That means that one of the things that we geneticists are discovering, because they used to say that this DNA was junk DNA, but it turns out the more highly evolved a system is, an organism is, the more of the so-called junk DNA it has. But what we're finding out is this junk DNA actually has information. It's messenger DNA. It also may have some enzymatic functions. That's the interesting thing about RNA. It can actually do more than DNA. And so that any time the cell is, as the cell functions or as the cell is communicating, it packages up these bits of genetic material, and these bits of genetic material go to different parts of the cell or from cell to cell. And if the cell is, hypermetabolizing or breaking down, these bits of genetic material which are packaged are then transmitted out of the cell or leave the cell. So what they've been calling viruses, especially RNA viruses or retroviruses, it turns out that most of that is not actually a virus, but it's these packaged pieces of normal genetic material, which are functioning in the way that they're supposed to function in terms of transmitting energy inside of the cell and from cell to cell.
Okay. So you also mentioned to me once, I have notes on this, about the jumping genes, that when they're looking at what they think is a virus, they're actually looking at genes that are excited.
Well,
right?
What happens that Barbara McCulloch was doing this research back as early as the 1940s, and because she was so far ahead of her time, she stopped talking to people about it because they had no idea what she was talking about. And I can't say that I blame her, but she was using X-rays as a biological stressor to look at the genes of maize, the type of corn. And what she discovered, because remember the genetic theory is that the genes were stationary. They didn't move. Once you had a gene, it was what it was, and it transmitted this information in one direction. And what she found is that no, your genes are not stationary. Your genes are moving all the time. So what happens is that essentially you are evolving immediately in terms of your environment, because your genes are always responding to inputs from the environment. And so your genes move around. For example, one of the things that the genetic theory thought that you would have one gene for one protein. But it turns out we only have about 20,000 genes, but we have thousands, many more thousands, almost a million proteins. So how does these few genes make all of these proteins? Well, it turns out that the genes can jump, they can be read in different ways. It's almost like an alphabet that can move around to make different words.
Wow, that's really fascinating. It makes complete sense that your genes would be reacting to meeting with your environment and having responses to it, and that this can be observed even, in that microscopic subcellular way. So,
well, this is dangerous material now, remember, because that means that we're talking about a type of consciousness at the energetic level.
But why wouldn't there be? I mean, who is it dangerous to?
Well, because we're in a materialistic society which doesn't believe in consciousness at this level, and that's one of the fights that a lot of scientists have been having, because the science that we have now is so materialistic. But the cell is not that. The cell is completely quantum, and so if we're talking about things that are happening at the quantum level, we're talking about a whole nother way of looking at the world. And so if we do that, it's going to totally break down the paradigm which is controlling science and controlling the way we are thinking right now. So we're moving into a whole new realm of how people think and behave.
Wow, that is fascinating right there. And so they're trying to keep a lid on this. They're denying it.
Right. I mean, that's what the whole humanist movement is about.
No, I understand that, but I hadn't framed it on the level of the cell as you just did. Mm-hmm. That the subparts of the cell are conscious and they're alive and they're part of us and we're responding as this complete whole.
Exactly.
And that it's really a matter of energy. And, however you define that.
Yeah.
If you define that as the uptake of electricity so that we can function, or the energy of consciousness and vibration. I mean, it's all kind of the same thing, right?
Right. And so what were called non-coding RNAs turn out to actually have messages which are used by the cell in order to do its job. And certainly we see a lot of this in when the embryo is developing. They say, they try to just say that these are human endogenous retroviruses. That's what they've called them, human endogenous retroviruses. But what they're calling endogenous retroviruses, it's a misnomer. It basically are these pieces of genetic material that are functioning as information carriers, doing a particular process, responding to environmental cues.
Now, was this material covered in your book to any extent? I mean, I remember your book being chock full of...
No, this is I've just about finished a new book, which actually is not for the lay public. It's mostly designed for physicians. Because as a physician, I wanted to know, okay, if HIV and AIDS wasn't what they said it was, then what was it, and how do we understand it, and is there a way that we can understand these processes that will also translate into how we do clinical medicine? So there were a lot of questions that had to be answered, and so I really began to look at this in a deeper way for an audience that has a more mature background in the sciences.
But I would suggest your AIDS, Opium, Diamonds, and Empire book for the general reader, especially the person who wants to learn a little more about not only just body biochemistry on the cellular level as it relates to disease formation, but economics and history. I mean, that book does some amazing things. It combines everything, and the overview that you give. Somebody said to me, and she's a very good writer herself, she said, this woman, meaning you, Nancy Banks, she can just say the most amazing things in a couple of sentences. And she said it like you were doing acrobatics with words, but you're doing it with the concepts in the words, So the book is a true pleasure to read, I have to say.
Yeah, and that's what I was doing. That book was actually for the general public, and so I wanted to write it in such a way that people could understand. And also, I think that one of the things that a lot of science writers do, and a lot of that they dumb things down because they think that the general public can't understand certain concepts, and I disagree with that. As a clinician, someone who's dealt with patients over time, I think that you can break down complex ideas into almost any complex idea can be broken down into simple words for people to understand.
Yeah, that's true. And then it's up to the people to string those simpler terms together and build their full picture. Right. That's what a lot of people don't do. And dumbing down just reduces it so much that it's almost meaningless.
Right.
And has no context. But
you just said the most important word. One of the things that happens, I think, that's been happening for quite some time, is that people are given information, but they're not given the context in which to make sense of that information.
That's true. And the context is both evolutionary, it's in terms of our bodies and our world and our rights even, you know?
Right, and all of this, you know, and this goes to the issue of complexity. It gets us away from linear thinking to the idea of we live in a complex world where you know, if a small thing can happen over here that can create a big thing over here. It's like the ripple in the pond. And so it allows us to actually broaden our scope of how we begin to look at things. So I can look at a political event like the Vietnam War and relate it to the outbreak of HIV/AIDS, because the Vietnam War impact because of the drugs that were coming into the country as a result of that war was the result that resulted in these particular oxidative stressors that allowed people to begin to get sick and show up in emergency rooms. So if you know, and you have to do that as a clinician, you because otherwise you're just going to believe what the CDC says. And let me just say a little bit about the CDC before I finish, because this will be my last thing for today. People have to realize that the CDC is the Center for Disease Control. They tell falsehoods all of the time, and they don't have to tell you the truth. And why is that? Because they have a mandate from the Department of Health, and so they can construe their mission broadly. But broadly for them means that they are protecting the pharmaceutical industry. The Department of Health in the United States also is an auspices of the Department of Defense. It's a war department. It has nothing to do with health. Their function is a little bit different than the FDA. The FDA operates a little bit differently. For example, the FDA operates under the auspices of the Uniform Commercial Code, which is a set of laws which businesses operate in this country. They also operate under the doctrine of informed consent. So, for example, when you read a package insert from the FDA, they will tell you all of the things that could go wrong or all of the problems with a particular product. That's why the commercials on television have all of those disclaimers. However, the CDC can take that same information and tell you something 180 degrees opposite. And so this is the confusion, for example, with the HIV test. The CDC can tell you that HIV test is 99.9% accurate. When you read the package insert from the FDA, they will tell you that you cannot use that test to diagnose. Why is that? They know that that test is not usable to diagnose because they've never identified the HIV. But the CDC doesn't tell you what numbers they're using. They are giving you 99.9% because not in terms of the disease, which the test is supposed to define, but that is in terms they're comparing it to another test, the same type of test on the market, but you don't know that. So they are giving you a number because the number that tells you how accurate the test is supposed to be a number that relates to the disease itself, but they're using a number that relates to another test to tell you how accurate that test is to the other test, not to the disease that it's supposed to be predicting.
So do the FDA and CDC exist on the same parallel or level, or does one oversee the other?
No, they're completely different organizations. The CDC is the public health department, which is the organization which is supposed to be responsible for the public health of the people of the United States. The FDA is designed to oversee the pharmaceutical industry or the companies that make products, healthcare products, for example, pacemakers, etc. They're supposed to be the ones who say whether or not to give you what those products can do and to approve those products.
And they both answer to another entity. But I'm trying to figure out what level they sit on. Does one answer to the other? But you're saying they're completely split and different.
They're two different agencies. They're two different agencies, two different heads. But as I said, the CDC, ultimately the CDC is a branch of the Department of Defense. The FDA is under Health and Human Services, I believe.
Well, again, this is almost beyond the average person's capacity to sort out and even worry about, since they believe what's on television and what's supplied by pretty pictures and the creation of illusion.
Well, I'm saying this because a lot of doctors don't know this. A lot of professional people don't know this, because there's one of the things that I saw, because I've had to figure out this confusion, because how can you say that a test is 99% accurate? It will tell you whether or not the person has the disease or doesn't have the disease. But at the same time, you can have a package insert that can tell you that you can't use this test to diagnose. I mean, it's crazy.
Right.
So the information that I just gave you, the lay public may not have anything to do with it. But if there are any physicians or professional people who are listening, they really need to understand the difference between these two organizations, to understand the confusion that they create, and that they ultimately are going to be responsible if they don't use the correct information for their patients, because ultimately they're the ones who end up in court, not the pharmaceutical company.
Well, thank you for making that distinction. And I do hope that this show gets spread, because there's tremendous depth in it and there's a lot of material here, and I think people need to listen to it a few times even. So I am grateful for the time, and hopefully we'll be able to pick up on another angle of all of this with you in the future.
Well, Sophie, it's been my pleasure. You asked terrific questions, and you're a great host.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, I'm doing this on behalf of everybody listening. But would you like to give out your website, please?
Yeah, it's nancybanksmd.com. Okay,
and people can go to Amazon and get your book, and they can get the book. I know there's an e-version also of AIDS, Opium, Diamonds, and Empire.
Yeah, the e-version is only about $10.
Yeah, it's very worth $10. I mean, I would suggest to people to get more than one copy, because they will have to read it over and over, and I've ruined mine. I won't take the stickies out because they mark important spots, but now I can't read it again either. So, all right, Nancy, have a great day, and I will look forward to welcoming you back another time, and I really appreciate everything you've done, the way you've put all this information together, and you can explain it to us on the air.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure. Have a great one.
Bye-bye.
Nos vemos.